Let's have a short basic view of the coronary circulation. Let's have an overview of the coronary circulation. The coronary circulation is made of two main arteries, and these are the right and left coronary arteries. Now, from where do these arteries come from? They come from the very beginning of the ascending aorta. And let's start with the right coronary artery. Where do I look for the right coronary artery? I look for it into the coronary sulcus. What is coronary sulcus? It is a groove, a depression between the atria and the ventricles, and here we find the right coronary artery. Now this right coronary artery will give branches to atria and right atrium and the right ventricle as it runs in the grooves. These branches are small branches, and these small branches are going to supply the right atrium, and it also gives a very important little branch to the sinoatrial node. Now, we know what is the sinoatrial node. It is the pacemaker of the heart. It is the beginning of the story of electric stimulation. Then the right coronary artery will continue in the coronary sulcus. As it reaches the lower border of the heart, it gives a marginal branch. This marginal branch, we can recognize it as it runs along the lower border of the heart, made by the border of the right ventricle. Then what is it going to do? It is going to curve posteriorly, goes to the posterior surface of the heart, where it's still in the coronary sulcus, but as it reaches the posterior interventricular sulcus, it is going to end up not giving a branch. It is going to end up as posterior interventricular artery. So that is the story of the right coronary artery. It is a long one. It comes from the right aortic sinus and runs in the coronary sulcus for a long distance till reaching the posterior interventricular sulcus, and during this way it's going to give branches to the right atrium and to the right ventricle. Now, what is the story of the left coronary artery? The left coronary artery is short. It is around 1 centimeter long, and very soon it is going to divide and gives two main branches. The first is the anterior interventricular artery, which of course runs in the anterior interventricular groove. Now, this anterior interventricular artery is going to supply the structures right and left. So it is going to supply the left ventricle, the right ventricle, and deep into the interventricular septum. Now, after running for 1 centimeter, it is going to continue as the circumflex artery. What does circumflex mean? It means that it is going to travel along the circumference of the heart. Where do I look for it? Of course, it's in the coronary sulcus. And where does it end? That is the posterior surface of the heart. It is going to meet an artery. Which artery? It is the posterior interventricular artery belonging to the right coronary artery, and it supplies the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now, the heart is a hollow muscular organ and needs a very good blood supply, and of course the very good arterial blood supply will need equally important venous system draining the venous blood from the heart. And the veins of the heart are as follows. We have the great cardiac vein. The great cardiac vein is found in the anterior interventricular sulcus, and it is running along the anterior interventricular artery, which is also called anterior descending artery. Then that's the great cardiac vein. Then we have the middle cardiac vein, and the middle cardiac vein runs along the posterior interventricular sulcus, running along the posterior interventricular artery, a branch of the right coronary artery. So we have a great cardiac vein, middle cardiac vein, and then we have anterior cardiac vein, and anterior cardiac vein runs in the coronary sulcus between the atrium and the ventricle. All these veins, they collect and create a large vein called coronary sinus. Where do I look for the coronary sinus? I look for it in the posterior coronary sulcus, and we have seen that when we looked at the posterior surface of the heart. Is it a large or a small vein? It's a large vein, and it is thin-walled, and there is no smooth muscle in that wall of this vein, and it ends up in the right atrium along with the superior and inferior vena cava. As the right coronary artery still having the same name. The anterior interventricular artery is going to supply the heart right and left, right ventricle and left ventricle, and deep also into supplying the interventricular septum. Here is a more extended story. Now, this is the very beginning of the aorta, and this is the anterior left aortic sinus, gives the origin or the opening of the left coronary artery, which is around 1 centimeter long, posterior to the pulmonary trunk, and it is very soon going to divide into the anterior interventricular artery, and the vein running along with it is the great cardiac vein, and it also gives a diagonal branch supplying the left ventricle, and then it continues as the circumflex artery, a branch of the left coronary artery. Then, when we look at the right coronary artery, it comes from the right anterior sinus of the very beginning of the aorta, and then it runs in the coronary sulcus, and it is supplying the right coronary sulcus. It is supplying the right atrium and the right ventricle. As it reaches the lateral margin of the heart, it gives a branch running along the inferior border of the heart, and this is called the marginal artery branch of right coronary artery. And then, as you can see, that the right coronary artery is much longer than the left. The left is only 1 centimeter long, while the right coronary artery runs a long distance along the coronary sulcus. This image may look strange to you because probably you have never seen that. This is what is called coronary angiogram. We put a cannula and we inject a dye into the coronary circulation and take an X-ray. This is a short artery coming from the aorta, therefore this is the left main trunk of the left coronary artery, and we can see that this artery soon is going to divide into 3 branches. The left anterior descending or anterior interventricular artery, the circumflex, and the marginal artery. We are not going to go into details of this angiogram at this point of time. Here is more extended story of the coronary arteries. If we look into this area, we can see the pulmonary trunk and the left auricle, and the left coronary artery arises deep to these structures. So if you want to see the left coronary artery, you have to lift the left auricle, and it is going to give the anterior descending artery or anterior interventricular artery, and this artery is going to reach the apex and then turns posteriorly. It also gives the diagonal branch and then the circumflex branch, and that's the story of the left side of the coronary circulation. Now, if we look into the right coronary artery, it's also deep to the pulmonary trunk and to the right auricle, and it comes from the right anterior sinus of the aorta, and it runs in the coronary sulcus and supplies the right atrium and right ventricle and gives the marginal branch running along the inferior border of the heart. Then it continues as right coronary artery and runs along the coronary sulcus, and look what is going to happen here. It is going to give the posterior interventricular artery, while the anterior interventricular artery is a branch of the left. The posterior one is in many cases, not all cases, is a branch of the right coronary artery, and these interventricular arteries, the anterior of the left and the posterior of the right, they reach an area where they may anastomose, may be connected, and underline may be because it is not always that they are connected. You know, this view of the heart, it is the inferior surface of the heart, and if you look for the left atrium, this is the posterior surface of the heart, and you can see that the prominent vessels in this figure are the veins. Now we have great cardiac vein, and we have middle cardiac vein, and we have a smaller vein, plus other veins that run with other arteries. Now we can see here that between the left ventricle and the right ventricle there is the posterior interventricular artery, and along with it is the middle cardiac vein. Now the middle cardiac vein will join the small cardiac vein in the coronary sulcus between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and they form the coronary sinus. This coronary sinus, which is still in the coronary sulcus between the left atrium and the left ventricle, this vein is a large vein, and as we know, it is having very thin wall, and there are no smooth muscles in its wall. It will run along the coronary sulcus, reaches the right atrium, and opens in the right atrium as it brings venous blood from the heart. This image is telling me that is the aorta, and the aorta has 3 aortic sinuses, 2 anterior and 1 posterior. The left anterior is going to give rise to the left coronary artery, just posterior to the pulmonary trunk, and the right anterior aortic sinus is going to give origin to the right coronary artery. Now back to basics. What parts of the heart does the circumflex artery supply? It is going to supply the left ventricle and the left atrium, giving branches up to the left atrium and down to the left ventricle. What parts of the heart does the left anterior descending artery supply. As we have seen, it is going to supply the right ventricle, the left ventricle, and the interventricular septum. Branches of which artery feed the right atrium? Now, of course, it is going to be the right coronary artery. What are the two arteries that come from the right coronary artery? It is going to give the marginal and posterior interventricular artery. What does the posterior interventricular artery supply? It is going to supply the same structures as the anterior interventricular. They are the right ventricle, the left ventricle, and the interventricular septum. Back to basics of science, and we need to test our knowledge and write down notes. What does the middle cardiac vein empty? It is going to empty remember, the middle cardiac vein runs along the posterior interventricular artery. Therefore, it is going to drain the posterior walls of the ventricles and the posterior part of the interventricular septum. What does the middle cardiac vein run with? Middle cardiac vein runs along the posterior interventricular groove or sulcus. Therefore, it is running with the posterior interventricular artery. What artery does the small cardiac vein run with? It runs in the coronary sulcus between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Therefore, it is going to run along the marginal artery. What does the small cardiac vein drain? It drains the right ventricle on the lateral side.